Hello everyone and welcome to another Code Karate video. As always, I'm Shane Thomas. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about AudioFeed. If you remember in the last video, I introduced AudioFeed, which is a product that a team and I worked on and recently released. If you're not familiar with AudioFeed, it's essentially a way for you to take your email newsletters, your articles, and even just random blobs of text, summarize it, and put it into an audio format. And essentially it builds a podcast for you that you can take with you in a podcast app or just listen to on the AudioFeed.ai website. And as someone who's interested in building websites, web apps, and products like this, it's always interesting to me to see how some of these products actually come together. So I thought it'd be really useful to break down how we thought about the problem and how we actually built it, going into detail on the tech stack that we used and some of the products that we used to string it all together. So in this first episode, I'm just going to be highlighting kind of the overall architecture of the tech stack, and then I'll go into, in future episodes, a little bit more detail on the different AI tools we use to piece all this together. Before we get started though, make sure to follow me on Twitter at smthomas3. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video because that's really helpful to us. But let's go ahead and get started and learn a little bit about the architecture of AudioFeed. For things like this, I like to use Excalidraw. It's a tool that makes it pretty easy to build a high-level architecture diagram. And so in this case, let's talk a little bit about how we built AudioFeed. So at the core of AudioFeed, it's essentially just a Next.js app. Now, we kind of went through back and forth how we were going to build this and if we want to use Next.js. I've done a lot with Gatsby. I used to work for Gatsby. And so we were kind of going back and forth between whether we should use Next.js or we should use Gatsby. And we ended up settling on Next.js, partially because I thought it'd be fun to build something, the product in something a little different than what I've been spending so much of my time on in the past few years. So it was a little bit of a way to try out something new that I haven't had as much experience with. So that was one reason. And then I'll tell you some of the other reasons as we kind of talk through the rest of the tech stack. And it's all hosted in Netlify. And we'll talk a little bit about why, but essentially it's a way for us to build and host this app. And at the end of the day, there's a few other things that kind of make up this. You know, anytime you're building an app, you need some kind of way to store your user information, store, in this case, the episodes that come in and all that. And so for that, we used Supabase. And the reason I chose Supabase is because it was just really simple. It kind of had a lot of the stuff that I needed out of the box, and it made it kind of an easy decision for us to say, let's build the back end. And it does scale pretty well, but we could always, a lot of times I see people try to build this really great back-end architecture, and they spend all this time on the back end, and then they never actually get something launched because they're spending so much time building. We wanted something that we could really throw together in a short amount of time, and then we could always reevaluate that later once we have actual users and traction. And honestly, Supabase seems to scale pretty well too from what we've seen so far. So it's been a great way for us to get started really quickly. It handles our authentication. It handles a lot of the database side behind the scenes, and it just makes things really easy for us to get started quickly. And on top of that, we needed a way for someone to be able to send in an email, and then for us to take the text of that email and then summarize it. And so for that, we used SendGrid's inbound parse. So SendGrid inbound parse. And essentially what that does is it allows someone to send in an email, and it'll get routed and sent as a post request into our Next.js app. And there's a few things that someone could do on the front end of this. They can send in a couple different things. They can send in email. Or they can send in text or a website. Let's just say a URL. And they can also send in some text. So there's three ways someone can interact with our APIs. They send in an email, they send in a URL, they send in text. If they send in an email, it'll hit SendGrid's inbound parse webhook, and then that'll forward it on to a Next.js API that we have. If they send in a text or a URL, it does something very similar and essentially just sends it into this Next.js API. So if they send in a URL, it actually uses Puppeteer to grab the content from that web page and then pass it through our summarization. If they send in text, we just take the text that they sent in. If we send in if it's an email sent through SendGrid's inbound parse, we basically store that in Supabase and then we grab that content and process it. So we have some APIs, and I'm just going to say these are our inbound APIs. There's a couple of them, but essentially it takes any of these and it knows what it is. All this, of course, is stored in Supabase. So once this comes in, we essentially, we're storing it, and then sometimes, we get data back. But it comes in, hits a collection of inbound APIs, stores the data in Supabase, reads data if it needs to, and then it's actually going to process all this text. So in this case, we have another API. And the important thing to note is this here is just a Netlify function that runs. And so this will go ahead and store it. And then essentially this kind of just calls this API process. And the reason we have this separate API process is you can think of this one as this is just a quick storage of what we need to do. So essentially just stores it. And then this API process actually is a background function that runs, and that allows us to have a longer lived function. It can run for, I believe, 15 minutes, because when we're processing and summarizing, we are often making a bunch of different calls to different AI services, and that can take a long time. It doesn't take 15 minutes typically, unless we're summarizing a book, but I wouldn't try that because, that takes a little while. But if it's just a web page, an email, something like that, it usually takes 30 seconds to 60 seconds. It's not too bad. But it's more than what you can typically do with just a standard API function. You want to make sure that it's something that can be a little bit more of a long-lived process. And with that, when it hits this API process endpoint here, we're going to go ahead and do a couple different things. First one is we're going to call our summarization service. And that's going to take whatever text we have, it's going to run it through, and honestly, there's multiple calls in here. It's not as simple as just sending one thing. There's, we're kind of breaking down sometimes into multiple pieces. We're summarizing bits of it, and then we're combining that summary back together. And then afterwards, we're going to send it to our text to audio service. And when we do that, that goes ahead and it takes the text that we got from the summary, it creates the audio, and then it returns that back. That, of course, gets written back into Supabase. Yeah, so that file is there and says, here's the actual audio file that was created. And then it's as simple as, and we're running out of room here, but we'll see if we can simplify this a little bit. Now, if we have, just our casual users, so in this case, we have web traffic on AudioFeed.ai. They're going to hit just our, in this case, maybe it's our, feed page. So /feed. And that request is going to come in. It's going to then go out to Supabase, load all of the episodes. I'm just going to do something like that. It's going to load the episodes in that feed and then allow this user to actually listen to those episodes with an audio player. And the same thing is happening here, where we have a podcast app. So this is still Netlify. And in this case, we're running out of room, /API/feed. And then there's actually it's feed ID. We could do the same thing for here. it's /feed ID. And let's go ahead and move this down. The podcast app is going to do something very similar in that try to clean this up a little bit. It's very similar to this though, so we can kind of just use the same thing here. But the podcast app is essentially going to request this feed ID. In this case, it just returns an RSS feed, and most podcast players can take that RSS feed and knows how to actually read those audio files. So this was a really quick summary of how it all works, but you can see this is the core underlying architecture of how we built AudioFeed. And in the next episodes, I'll talk a little bit about what this summarization service is, what's the AI behind that, and what tools we use for this text-to-audio service. And I'll give you a little preview of how that works and show you a couple examples. Before we do, actually there's one other step here I want to highlight. We actually, rather than going straight to these services, there's one thing I missed, and we'll talk about this possibly in the future as well. We have, we'll just call it our AI platform. So actually everything gets funneled through this, and this essentially just works as a proxy to send in and receive these summaries. And that's really all there is to it. So that's it for this time. Make sure to let me know what you think in the comments below. Make sure to check out AudioFeed. Give me some feedback. Would appreciate any of that you can provide. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.